Hi, everybody. Welcome back to PCS 101, and this is for our class for Thursday, the 13th. And now that you have completed speech number 2, the informative speech, it is time for us to discuss preparation for speech number 3. And if you haven't already guessed what your attendance question will be today, will be your review of your peers' speech number 2, but I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few moments. In terms of speech number 3, that's going to be due on the 4th of December. And this will be a 15-minute speech, so it is the longest of the speeches. And you are going to be asked to use at least 3 outside resources. I stopped counting after 3, so you can use as many as you'd like, and they can be any configuration that you'd like. So if you want to use 3 online sources, that's fine. I ask that on your outline, you indicate at the ending of your outline your 3 sources so that I can just give a quick review. In the real world, you wouldn't necessarily be sharing your sources with your audience unless they requested it. So you should always have your sources with you. And the good news is that since ultimately this is an oral presentation, you don't necessarily have to follow the rules that you would follow with documentation with a written work. So if you want to use the MLA system, that's fine. If you want to use the APA system, that's fine. Basically, the idea is that you have the major pieces of information necessary to share with an audience member if an audience member were to ask you where you were able to derive your information from, just so that they could verify it. Again, we talked a little bit about this in a previous class that usually all you need to do is to give a tag in your speech to let your audience know that you are citing an outside source. They're not going to want the details about things like page numbers or place of publication, but you should have that information handy in the event that an audience member wanted it. And there are lots of different ways that you could go about using outside resources. It doesn't necessarily have to be your traditional outside resource. So it could be something like an interview, as we had talked about before, as long as the person that you're interviewing is is relevant for your topic. And of course, you've gotten all of the appropriate permissions and so forth. So the goal of the persuasive speech is to convince, and this is either to convince the audience about a particular belief or to convince the audience to take action, or perhaps a bit of both. I'm not quite sure which might be more challenging. I suppose it depends. Sometimes it's easier to get an audience to take action. Perhaps something like signing a petition, for instance, might be easier to get an audience member to do than to actually change their belief system, that they sign the petition just because they don't want to be bothered anymore or because this is a photo op for them. Or the opposite can happen, that it's easy to, or easier, I should say, to change an audience member's belief, but more difficult to change their action. I think most people believe that they should eat better and exercise, but of course, the trick is implementing that. So, it needs to be about a topic that can be debated. And that means that you're not talking about a fact, and you're probably integrating many of the elements of the first and the second speech. So I wouldn't be surprised if you made references to yourself in this persuasive speech, much like you did in your autobiographical speech. And you're certainly going to need to use outside information in order to be able to support your particular positions. That's going to give additional credibility to you and your speech. So the informative speech helped prepare you for that. And you can decide if you want to choose a topic that is very controversial or very not controversial. It's pretty much up to you. Just remember, we've been talking about ethos and making sure that you're ethical. You want to be respectful to your audience, and you want to be also respectful to the speaker. And in terms of thinking about what to discuss, you might want to review some of the things that perhaps you talk about at the dinner table that you wish were different. And you can also perhaps review the news and see if there are any topics there. Or you could review your first and your second speech and see if there are any topics there. So, we could take an entire class about how to motivate individuals. So, this is just a very condensed version. That basically, there are three major ways to motivate individuals: affiliation, the desire to belong. People want to belong. We see this in television commercials all the time when we're told this is the number one product. It's that you want to belong to the group that's purchasing the number one product. Achievement or success, which in some ways flies in the face of affiliation or belonging because not everybody can achieve necessarily excellence. And again, I think about something like a car commercial where they might talk about that this is the most popular vehicle that's been sold this year. So that's the belonging. Or they could talk about a vehicle that is much more exclusive, and you would get that sense based on the clothing of the driver and the house perhaps that they drive up to, that there's a certain level of affluence associated with this vehicle. Or power. People want control. And again, I'll go back to the automobile analogy and trying to sell a car, and that you may not have control in your family or your workplace, but behind the wheel, you can control everything. So there is one more appeal, and it probably works better than any of the three I discussed, but it is highly dangerous, and that is fear. And we have seen how the media has utilized fear to motivate behavior and to motivate belief. The problem with fear is that it interferes with reasoning. So you need to use it quite cautiously. And that's not to say it can't be used. Again, perhaps the ends justify the means. I'm not sure. But I think about public service announcements, for instance, that might utilize fear to encourage individuals not to drink and drive. And again, the greater good might outweigh any of the manipulation that's involved with using fear. That's something that you have to decide for yourself. Now, the text talks about a theorist named Monroe who came up with what's known as his motivated sequence about ultimately the process of going through motivating an individual to support a belief or an action. And much of this is common sense, is that you need to draw attention to your issue. You need to establish that there's a need. You need to show that your proposal will lead to a certain level of satisfaction. You want to help visualize with the audience about how things would improve or not improve if the audience did or did not follow your suggestions. And then if there's a call to action, that would be the place to make it. And what you're doing is you're putting forth an argument. So when teachers talk about arguments, they're talking about putting forth a claim, in other words, a position for which you provide evidence, facts, and some sort of a reasoning pattern. Now, there are lots of different claims that you can put forth, and just to briefly review some of them, they sound like they are foolproof, but not necessarily. Claim of fact, where something is or is not the case. So, for instance, it would seem to be a fact that GCC is a small school. The problem with that is in comparison to what? It could be compared to other schools that are even smaller, and in that instance, GCC would be a large school. Claim of value, those are tricky. Things that are either good or bad, because ultimately that is somewhat subjective. So, GCC is a good school. And the question is, how do you measure such a thing? Is it a graduation rates? Is it transfer rates? Is it job placement rates? The idea of a claim of policy, a course of action. So you might propose an action such as GCC should reestablish a sports program. Actually, GCC used to have a sports program. But of course, you have to think about the pros and the cons, and hopefully the pros outweigh the cons. Would establishing a sports program really improve enrollment? or would it be more of a financial burden? And again, you've got to weigh the back and forth. The reason why it was initially eliminated years ago was because of the costs associated with it. And in terms of reasoning patterns, lots of different ways you can go about reasoning. Inductive reasoning, that you're using examples and then drawing some sort of a conclusion based on those examples. Think about medical studies, for instance, where you are testing the efficacy, let's say, of a particular drug. Deductive reasoning is a generalization that you make based on all of those specific examples. For instance, that college leads to success. There's plenty of examples to support that, but there are also plenty of examples to show that that's not the only way to achieve success. Or reasoning from sign, in other words, an observable mark. So, for instance, if you feel yourself with a sore throat, that might be the sign or the signal to you that you're going to get a head cold, because there have been enough examples in your past that when this has happened, the end result has been a head cold. Now, people commit errors in reasoning all the time, and what you want to try to do when you are delivering a speech is not to commit an error in reasoning. And certainly when you're evaluating the speeches of others, you want to see whether or not you can judge if they have committed errors in reasoning. Some of the errors, such as hasty generalization, something that has too little evidence associated with it, but you draw a conclusion. Or an appeal to ignorance. In other words, what we don't know, prove me wrong. So I'm a space alien until you prove that I'm human. The burden of proof should be on me, not on you. The hasty generalization might be something to the effect of a particular course is not popular because it hasn't filled to capacity for the last couple semesters. It could be based on the popularity of the course, but it could be based on the time of the course, or it could be based on the instructor for the course, or a number of other variables. The bandwagon fallacy, the typical teenage argument that just because everybody else is doing it, you want to do it too. And the idea of joining the crowd. This is one of the ways that the number one product effect works, is that everybody wants to join the bandwagon. The sequential fallacy, that there is a direct relationship between cause and effect. So if I had a cold when I was taking a quiz, that's why I performed poorly on the quiz. Except I've been performing poorly on quizzes my entire life, so therefore the cold is irrelevant. So there isn't necessarily a direct cause and effect relationship about that cold and my performance on the quiz, let's say. Begging the question, you're rephrasing the question. It's circular reasoning, basically. So what is, let's say, the faculty parking lot? It's a parking lot for faculty. And basically, you've just rephrased the question. Appeal to authority, it sounds like it would be valid, but oftentimes what it is just an endorsement by somebody who's popular or celebrity. They don't necessarily have the background in order to offer their particular expertise. Name calling, attacks on individuals, and unfortunately we see this more and more in our political realm. And a genetic fallacy, the idea that just because you have done something in the past that you should continue to do it in the present. I see this happen in the workplace all the time. Why am I filling out this form? Because we've always filled out this form. That's a genetic fallacy. Just because you've always done it, that doesn't mean that you should continue to do it. So the last thing I wanted to talk about was the last chapter I had assigned for you to read about diversifying speeches, about basically making sure that you adapt to your medium and your occasion. Obviously, you've all had to adapt to an online situation rather than a face-to-face situation. So that has required different skills. So you have to think about, is this going to be face-to-face? Is this going to be recorded? Is your speech introductory? Is it informative? Is it persuasive? And then based on all of those elements, you can make decisions on how to proceed. Think about the technology you have available, how interactive you want it to be, how people have notoriously poor attention spans. You want to try to be as inclusive as possible, as accessible as possible, and as flexible as possible. And actually, talking about things like face to face classes, I am offering a public speaking class next semester in a face to face format. That gets us to the issue of registration, and you're probably already aware that our registration period is open. I encourage you to register sooner rather than later, and that means that you have all kinds of choices about instructors and times and modalities, and you can find the schedule on the GCC website if you were to scroll down to career options and finding classes. But I've also included the link for you on today's Moodle page so that you could look up the schedule if you so wanted to. And you can see that you can find classes for both the intersession, which is the period of time when we have a break between the fall and the spring semester. And it is a highly condensed way to take a class in about 3.5 weeks or so. You do the equivalent of 16 weeks. So it is intense, but it does serve a certain population. And I actually teach during the intersession, I teach an online version of public speaking in the intersession. I think it adapts nicely to that kind of format. But you can also search for your spring classes. And as I had indicated, this upcoming spring, I'm going to be teaching a face to face version of public speaking. If you're curious as to what else I'm teaching, though you can also do instructor searches as well. I'm teaching, and I believe I might have mentioned this at the beginning of the semester, that I'm a horror fan aficionado. So I am teaching a class in horror film, and that will be in an online format, which is run very similarly to this one. Shakespeare class, which is also online and runs similarly with my recording myself. Um, Also, if you haven't fulfilled your English 112 or 116 requirement, what we call Comp 2, I'll be teaching sections of those as well. But if you've got any questions about the schedule, please let me know. You should have heard from your advisor, but you can also reach out to your advisor. If you don't know who your advisor is, you can look that up on my GCC. You can go to the advising center to register. If you have your PIN, you can advise yourself. I, as an advisor, actually release the PINs to my advisees so they can advise themselves. Not every advisor does that, but certainly you could reach out to your advisor to do that if you so wanted your PIN. And again, ask me if you've got any questions. Our next class, we're taking our third quiz, and you'll be seeing some sample persuasive speeches, actually just one sample persuasive speech, and asked to respond to it before we actually present. So I wanted to end today early because your assignment now is to watch all of the informative speeches that were uploaded onto the Moodle site by your peers and to send me via email, please, so that we've got a certain level of confidentiality, to send me a very brief list of the strengths and weaknesses that you've encountered with each speaker. So send me one strength and one weakness of each of your peers' speech number 2 to my email at Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu by Saturday the 16th. Certainly, if you need additional time, let me know. I will compile all of that data and get that to you, and I will also get to you my evaluation of your speech number 2. So if you haven't sent me an outline yet, please do so. And I hope you're doing well, and I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.